What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. We're going to get a little weird today talking about my top 10 favorite erotic science fiction films or sexy sci-fi films because recently The Substance racked up 5 Oscar nominations, and I thought that was pretty goddamn cool for a movie that is, has a lot of pretty wild, disturbing, provocative imagery. It also generated $50 million in box office off a budget of $17 million. And I just found a perverse sense of pleasure in the fact that after Universal got cold feet and refused to release the movie, Mubi stepped in and did just fine with it, proving that there actually is an audience for these kinds of movies. It might not be an audience the size of like the Avengers, but it is there. And if you make these movies with creativity and a little bit of balls, then you actually can find an audience and potentially rack up some awards. There are a lot of people who think that Demi Moore is actually going to win Best Actress this year, but we will have to wait and see in a few weeks' time. But high five to Coralie Fargeat, or I'm always getting her name wrong, but high five to Coralie Fargeat and her entire team for making The Substance into the success that it is. But this was not my first barbecue when it came to being aroused by or stimulated by or just like provoked by really sexual imagery in the wonderful genre of science fiction. Because going all the way back to the 1920s with Fritz Lang and Metropolis, we have a pretty provocative erotic striptease going on, which is kind of like the catalyst for the entire plot of the movie moving forward. So as long as we're giving out high fives, let's also give a high five to Brigitte Helm for giving that dance scene her all. And I'm sure if I looked long and hard, no pun intended, I could find some earlier examples of filmmakers combining science fiction and erotic imagery. But I'm mostly going to be concerned with movies from like the early 60s onward when censorship started to relax, the production code started to relax. And also, I'll obviously be biased by my own personal taste in the movies that I grew up on, although there are a lot of modern movies that I'm going to be discussing today as well. And it should go without being stated that I don't regard this list as like the final word on erotic science fiction films, because it obviously reflects my own personal taste. If your personal taste is more in line with gazing lustily upon Sean Connery and Zardoz and fantasizing about his hairy thighs, more power to you. Make that list, make that video. I strongly encourage you to do so. Although Zardoz will come up later on in this list, but for very different reasons. But if you go back to the old days, you had actresses like Fay Wray, providing some pretty saucy stuff in movies like King Kong, if you consider King Kong to be a science fiction movie. I've never quite known, is it science fiction, or is it a horror movie, or what? Is it just a big, giant adventure movie? King Kong, I feel like it fits neatly into a lot of different categories, but obviously Fay Wray, holy moly, she also gave that movie her all. But I'm not ashamed to admit that going back to my earliest days as a movie fan, I have thoroughly enjoyed seeing all kinds of erotic imagery in science fiction. I mean, watching movies like Flash Gordon just absolutely blew my mind as a little kid, or seeing Return of the Jedi in the theater, or seeing the lovely Sigourney Weaver in Alien. I mean, I can guarantee that I'm not alone in loving all these scenes. Even if they're not the feature attraction of the movies, they remain an enduring part of the movie's popularity. But let's discuss a few guidelines for this list. I'm going to use the same criteria that I used for my erotic horror movie list, which I did a couple years ago, which is now my top 5 videos that I've ever made. I'm like, God damn, well, people like these kinds of videos, so I'm going to make more of them. But the movie has to function equally well as science fiction as it does like as an erotic movie or a movie with titillation. Like no hardcore porn. There's one movie in my list that's going to be kind of borderline, but it does work as a science fiction film. But I feel like if you just want to see porn, well then look up porn, more power to you. Have a blast, have a good time. But I'm still going to be concerned with good movies and or schlocky movies that are great fun, movies that are worth revisiting. And I actually saw a ton of movies for the first time in preparation for this list, because whenever I'm doing this list, I think, oh, I can do this list in 5 minutes. I can do it, bang it out in one afternoon. Once again, no pun intended. But as I started getting prepared, I was like, well, shit, there are a ton of Roger Corman movies that I've never seen, or a ton of low-budget kind of forgotten gems from the 70s and 80s that I've always been aware of that I've never seen. Suddenly, a few days have gone by, and I've seen like 15 or 20 new science fiction movies. So I love doing these lists, but I always lie to myself thinking that they're going to be really, really easy to make. They're actually incredibly time-consuming, but they're also incredibly rewarding and incredibly fun to make. But also, because there's so many incredible movies to get to in my honorable mentions and in my list, I'm going to leave television out of this conversation entirely. Because if I include TV, well, then that should just be its own video. Like recent shows like Season 1 of Altered Carbon have gone all out, or the first season of Westworld have gone all out. But TV's been giving us some pretty saucy stuff for many, many years, like Alyssa Milano and The Outer Limits, where I grew up watching Aaron Gray and Buck Rogers. And also, Buck Rogers is kind of a weird borderline project because the initial pilot was released theatrically in theaters for months before the show finally came out. But yeah, so Buck Rogers, I feel like, could apply to both a TV list as well as a movie list. And of course, you've got true sexual icons like Jerry Ryan as Seven of Nine, where I think if Seven of Nine had not have been in the show Star Trek Voyager, that show would have been canceled much earlier than it did. But she single-handedly kept that show alive by wearing the cat suit, or in some cases, not wearing the cat suit.
If you're attempting to embarrass me, you won't succeed.
But honestly, the main reason I don't want to get into sci-fi TV is because of Battlestar Galactica. Because if I start talking about Battlestar Galactica, I mean, it'll just turn into like a 2-hour love fest about Tricia Helfer, who completely, totally changed the game when it came to combining sexuality and sci-fi in the wonderful world of TV. So I just refuse to go down that rabbit hole. We must maintain a sense of high moral fiber on this channel at all times. We must maintain the utmost ethical standards when it comes to the depiction of sexuality on YouTube. But in all seriousness, I don't quite know what is the borderline for age-restricted content versus non-age-restricted content, because it's different from like NC-17 and R and that sort of thing for movies. And if you go over to YouTube, they'll say that age-restricted content is basically any video that invites sexual activity, such as provocative dancing or fondling. Well, that's going to be in here. Or a video where the subject is in a pose that is intended to sexually arouse the viewer. That's clearly going to be in here. Or a video where the subject is in clothing that is considered unacceptable in public contexts, such as lingerie. So I guess I'm doomed to have an age-restricted label slapped on this video, but I'm not going to include nudity. I'm going to try in my own way to like follow the rules that I think they should be. I feel like unless there's nudity, it should be available to anybody. But when I did my video about my top 10 favorite erotic thrillers from the 1980s, even though I very carefully did not include nudity in that video, it did get slapped with an age restriction on it. But let's not waste any more time, and I feel like the best place to start in my honorable mentions is discussing the great filmmaker Roger Corman, who used to boast and brag about how he produced 100 movies in Hollywood and never lost a dime. I don't know if that's the case. He definitely produced more than 100 movies, but in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, he was one of the guys who realized, all right, I'm making these low-budget movies, whether they're race car movies or science fiction movies or horror movies or Edgar Allan Poe movies or whatever, but if I have a certain amount of violence and or nudity for like every 5 to 10 pages in the script, then I can make these movies on the cheap and people will like them, especially when he was handling writing duties or directing duties. And I think the best place to start is with X, The Man with the X-Ray Eyes, a movie that must have set the imagination of my grandmother ablaze because it starred her favorite movie star, Ray Milland. But obviously this movie is pretty squeaky clean and pretty innocent by today's standards. But in the early 60s, as his powers start to kick in, he goes to a party where he suddenly realizes the girl that he's dancing with, as well as everybody in the party, he can see them naked, and it's just absolutely scandalous. But I think the movie actually works really, really well as both science fiction and horror. But if you want to figure out where does the modern era begin when it comes to combining nudity and sci-fi, I feel like X, The Man with the X-Ray Eyes, is as good a place to start as any. But as the 1970s got underway, there was no genre that Roger Corman allowed to remain kind of unmolested. And at that time, it was like one genre that was very much in vogue were car movies, or basically like car porn movies, movies like Vanishing Point, things like that. And so Roger Corman took science fiction and the car movie and quite literally collided them together with Death Race 2000, which is a pretty kick-ass little down and dirty science fiction film. It's got David Carradine and Sly Stallone in an early role. But the reason it's on this list is because of Simone Griffith. And there's not a ton of nudity in this movie, but what's there is great. And there's one really elaborate massage scene where all the racers are all being kind of rubbed down. And Sly Stallone is there in his towel, angrily accusing his driving partner of infidelities. But anyway, Death Race 2000 is really cool. But it seems like Roger Corman was almost waiting for the arrival of Star Wars and Alien before he finally realized, all right, I know the formula moving forward. Like, make my movies at 100th the budget of those films, but kind of rip off some of their best ingredients and then add a little Roger Corman seasoning in, which leads to movies like Star Crash from 1978, starring the lovely Caroline Munro, who was a true sexual icon of 70s genre cinema. She was a Hammer horror star in all kinds of good movies. She was a Bond girl in The Spy Who Loved Me. But Star Crash might be her crowning achievement. And I love the quote by Christopher Plummer about making this movie where he said, "Give me Rome any day. I'll do porno in Rome as long as I can get to Rome." And while the film doesn't quite qualify as porno, it does feature a lot of scantily clad goddesses doing kung fu and fighting in a sci-fi setting. So that's absolutely, if you're into schlock, you definitely got to check out Star Crash. And then we also have movies like Death Sport from 1978. I mean, Roger Corman up to his old tricks. And one of the reasons I really like Death Sport is that it stars and features my all-time favorite Playboy playmate, Claudia Jennings. And she'll come up again in this list. In my official top 10, she's going to pop up later on. But Death Sport is pretty goddamn good if you are a Claudia Jennings fan. And if you're not a Claudia Jennings fan, well then what's wrong with you? Look her up. You'll become one. Humanoids from the Deep does not take any inspiration from Alien or from Star Wars. But it's 1980, and this is when we start getting into the kind of subgenre of science fiction films that basically are like, what happens when monsters and humans screw and or get raped or molested or whatever the case might be. There are a lot of movies within that subgenre where you have both men and women getting along with aliens, and there'll be many, many more to come. Or if not aliens, mutants, but Humanoids from the Deep. It has one scene involving a ventriloquist where I'm like, holy moly, this is steamy stuff. In addition to one of the steamiest posters ever designed by a human being. But in the early 1980s, we have a great example of what made Roger Corman so successful, because back in the late 50s and early 60s, when he was making all of his horror movies, he would build like a cheap mansion, use it for several movies, and burn it down, and then use those shots in several movies. He was he knew how to economize on his movies and make his dollar go as far as humanly possible. And he did a similar thing with 3 science fiction films, Galaxy of Terror, Forbidden World, and and Horror Planet, aka Inseminoid, where he had the good fortune of hiring James Cameron as an art director / production designer on Galaxy of Terror, and he designed all these incredible sets. He's like, fuck it, I'm going to reuse them a few more times. But as I was watching Galaxy of Terror for the first time, I was unaware of James Cameron's involvement. So as I was watching, I was like, oh my god, like what a ripoff. James Cameron must have seen this movie before he made Aliens, because so many ideas in Galaxy of Terror are then used in Aliens. Then I looked up the credits and I realized, all right, well, James Cameron worked on Galaxy of Terror, so we'll give him a pass. But I think of all the Roger Corman movies from this period, Galaxy of Terror definitely has the best professional polish and the best professional kind of coat of paint, and that's all due to James Cameron. But goddamn, if you love Aliens, you got to watch Galaxy of Terror. But it's also got Robert Englund in there. It's also got a pretty horrific, horrifying monster on human sex scene, which I will not include here because I think my channel will get terminated for all time. And I won't say that the encounter is erotic in Galaxy of Terror, but it's definitely the gooeyest of all the sex scenes that I'm going to be discussing on this list today. And that's saying something, because there are quite a few gooey scenes. But as I mentioned before, the sets from Galaxy of Terror were so good, they were then reused on Forbidden World. And I'm going to talk about Forbidden World a little bit later, because Forbidden World from 1982 is actually going to be my number 10. It's a new discovery for me, so maybe I've got a little bit of a recency bias, but I think Forbidden World can stand toe-to-toe with any of the other movies on this list. But at any rate, I just feel like discussing some of the science fiction films produced by Roger Corman and or written and directed by him was the perfect place to start when it comes to how can filmmakers combine these two kind of subgenres of eroticism and science fiction in tantalizing ways that will lead to box office success and movies with very long shelf lives that still withstand the test of time all these decades later. But now that we've given the legendary Roger Corman his due, for the rest of my honorable mentions, I'm going to more or less go through them chronologically, and I'm sure plenty of movies will slip through the cracks. Keep the recommendations coming. I'm always on the lookout for fresh discoveries. Like I said, I saw a ton of movies for the first time preparing for this video. But for my honorable mentions, let's start with Flesh Gordon from 1974, a movie that I must admit I'm not that big a fan of, apart from the poster. They should have just released the poster and not the movie, but you can't talk about erotic sci-fi without at least tipping your hat to Flesh Gordon, which came out, I think, 6 years before the Flash Gordon movie. But in the same year, we have another science fiction film that I do like.
Zardoz speaks to you.
Sorry, I should say, like's a strong word. I'm fascinated by Zardoz because it's such a strange cultural oddity. But in this really strange dystopian science fiction film, you basically have two different civilizations. One which is very primitive, represented by Sean Connery, and one which is very civilized, but also like kind of effete and ineffectual, represented by Charlotte Rampling and her friends. And their civilization become so civilized and so highbrow, they've lost the ability to understand erotic stimulation because they no longer reproduce through sex. They reproduce other ways. And so in this great demonstration, she's trying to explain how they've lost the ability to understand how a penis goes from being flaccid to aroused. And they start subjecting Sean Connery's character to all this imagery, seeing if they can provoke a response. And then in this great close-up of just Sean Connery's face as he's looking at Charlotte Rampling, they achieve the desired response. But anyway, only Charlotte Rampling and Sean Connery know how to deliver these kinds of complex, nuanced scenes. But then in 1975, we have the Rocky Horror Picture Show, one of the all-time great midnight movies. A movie that, in theory or on the surface, should be a cultural hand grenade in any era in which you choose to release it or re-release it. But for some reason, because the music is so goddamn entertaining and the characters are so delightful and the movie's just so fucking funny, I feel like you can show the Rocky Horror Picture Show to anybody, irrespective of their views on sexuality or gender or whatever the case might be, and they're going to have a fucking blast. Rocky Horror Picture Show, I've been watching it on a repeat since I was like 14 years old. Never fails to delight. But if I'm being honest, my favorite scene is when Susan Sarandon throws all caution to the four winds and starts proclaiming loudly that, well, anyway, the lyrics are delightful. I can't play the song here because of copyright, but it's, touch me, I want to feel dirty, all that good stuff. Anyway, if you haven't watched it in a while, dig back in. But next up from 1976, we have Logan's Run, a sci-fi movie that I think a lot of people have kind of forgotten about due to the fact that Star Wars came out the following year. But it's a very solid, down and dirty science fiction film from a pre-Star Wars era where these movies just had much smaller budgets. But the reason I like it, one of my childhood crushes was Jenny Agutter or Agutter. I've always been a little dodgy or iffy on her pronunciation of her last name, but I loved her from An American Werewolf in London. But many years later, I discovered her in Logan's Run. And yeah, as advertised, she is an absolute goddess. But while we're on the subject of science fiction and sexuality, we can't leave James Bond out of the equation. And of course, you might be saying, James Bond, that's not science fiction. But he's just a super spy, a gentleman spy. But in the late 70s, James Bond did indeed go to space. The book Moonraker, the opening of it, well, the book Moonraker is quite different from the movie Moonraker, but the opening of the book Moonraker, which is right here, is one of my favorite James Bond experiences ever, where Bond and M go and play bridge against the villain of the story, and it's just delightful. But as far as sexuality is concerned, at the end of Moonraker, after James Bond and the lovely Lois Chiles, a.k.a. Dr. Goodhead, anyway, I'll just let you process that, are coming back, we see the following scene unfold.
007. My God, what's Bond doing?
I think he's attempting re-entry, sir.
And all I'll say to that scalawag James Bond, that dirty dog, is don't ever change. But in 1979, we got one of the most iconic moments in the history of erotic science fiction, even though the movie's not particularly erotic. But if you've seen Alien from 1979, you know what I'm talking about before I even show it. But toward the very end of the movie, when Sigourney Weaver discovers that there's an alien in her little escape shuttle, well, then she's got to quickly do a wardrobe change. And just that, half second of footage has been stimulating and just blowing the minds of science fiction fans ever since. And I think a lot of people saw that scene and they've never fully recovered. But in 1980, we get Flash Gordon. And I can still vividly recall at age 4, I was in my mother's bathroom and she was combing her hair or something like that. And the newspaper was open. And back then the newspaper had all these big giant movie poster ads, advertising whatever was playing that weekend. And there was this huge poster for Flash Gordon. I was like, Mommy, what's that? In any event, I can't remember if I saw it in the theater or just on HBO because once again, I was really, really young. But I watched Flash Gordon over and over and over again. But it's obviously the lovely Ornella Muti or Muti. And once again, I should have looked up some of these names ahead of time. But there's just too many lovely actresses to get to. But for a PG movie and one that is relatively kid-friendly, there's actually some pretty saucy stuff in this movie with Ornella Muti watching Sam Jones getting changed and promising that she's not going to watch and blah, blah, blah. In any case, age 4, age 5, let's just say that she started having a powerful impact on my young, impressionable brain. But after that, we have a fresh discovery from me, which I did not see until last night, but we have Extro from 1982, a movie that is just batshit insane, totally bonkers. But the reason it's on this list is because it has two completely, totally awe-inspiring but also unnecessary scenes involving Miriam Dabo. It's a French name. The reason I know who she is that she was a Bond girl in The Living Daylights, and she's just pure dynamite in The Living Daylights. She's the cello player who James Bond, a.k.a. Timothy Dalton, falls in love with. But in Extra, she plays basically like a nanny or a babysitter, where she spends the entire movie trying to bone her boyfriend while this little boy's like, will you play hide and seek with me? And she's constantly getting annoyed, but holy moly. We want to talk about a movie that's punching above its weight class when it comes to nudity. Extra gets the job done. But for 1983, we must pause and just acknowledge the all-time iconic status of Carrie Fisher in the slave Leia outfit, because as much as people might protest and proclaim, oh, this is scandalous, this is amoral, this is unethical, yada, 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 go to any comic book convention anywhere on planet Earth, and you will see hundreds, if not thousands, of people dressed up as slave Leia. They're so scandalized and so shocked that they've decided to walk around in public as her for days on end. And it doesn't matter what age they are or what size they are. They do not care. They love the outfit, and they love it with good reason. So for everybody out there who's been trying to tisk and shame on you, like how dare you, blah blah blah, all of y'all can go fuck off and just let us enjoy Return of the Jedi and the lovely Carrie Fisher. But in 1985, we have a very important movie, at least from my own childhood, because my siblings and I, we watched John Hughes movies on repeat, 16 Candles, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, etc. and so forth. But Weird Science, holy crap, as dramatically compelling as Breakfast Club might have been, it was Weird Science that got the most airtime in our household. I have no idea why. Maybe you'll see Kim Malin flying out the chimney buck-ass nude, but the reality is Kelly LeBrock brings the fucking heat, and it's not just all the titillation scattered throughout. She's actually fucking hilarious. Weird Science, definitely an iconic sci-fi erotic movie, and also a pretty goddamn good comedy. Not every honorable mention is equally good, however.
Breeders
from 1986 deserves an honorable mention, but it's a pretty rotten movie, but it's just got a ton of skin in it. The Hidden, 1987, doesn't have a lot of skin, but what little there is, presented by the lovely Claudia Christian, is awesome. I mean, that movie, it's a killer little down and dirty science fiction horror movie just in its own right, but suddenly in the middle of the movie, you just get this nice little treat for watching the movie. And so thank you, Claudia Christian, because you blew all our goddamn minds. But we've reached the era where Paul Verhoeven arrived on the shores of the United States and changed movies forever. And while obviously when it comes to sex, he's better known for Basic Instinct and Showgirls, but when it comes to science fiction, he always would sprinkle in a little mature content, which just made his science fiction movies a little different. Like there's that scene in RoboCop where Miguel Ferrer is doing cocaine with those two girls, and they're like snorting coke out of cleavage and that sort of thing. I was like, whoa, this is how adults party. Or in Total Recall in 1990, where out of nowhere, I think it's Lycia Nath shows up with the triple boobies, which I will not show here, but it was just like, oh my lord, like what is going on here? I saw that movie in the theater at age 14, and my jaw just went, "Jigong," slammed into the floor. But obviously, Sharon Stone has a little bit of nudity in there as well. It's kind of her warm-up for it's her warm-up for Basic Instinct, which came 2 years later. Came, once again, no pun intended.
I can't believe you're jealous of a dream.
Who is she?
Nobody.
Nobody.
But this movie is just, it's got Arnold's junk on the brain, because Sharon Stone obviously famously kicks him in the balls hard at one point. But he also gets kind of aggressively grabbed by his girlfriend when he walks into that club. And she's like, what have you been feeding this thing? And he says, blondes.
What you been feeding this thing?
Blondes.
Just for science fiction, you don't really usually think of like action sci-fi as being provocatively sexual. But Total Recall definitely gets it done. And then we get Starship Troopers a few years later, which did not feature Denise Richards in the nude. That would come later in Wild Things. However, it did have that shower scene where men and women alike, they're all showering together, they're all training for war. And the version of the story I heard was that on the set, some of the actors were acting a little shy, and both Paul Verhoeven as well as his DP dropped their pants to their ankles and said, nudity's no big deal, we're from Europe, like who cares? And anyway, everybody stripped down and had a fine time shooting that scene from Starship Troopers. But thank you, Paul Verhoeven, for always bringing a little additional edge and provocation and maturity to all of your sci-fi endeavors. And I hope that you're not completely finished with the sci-fi genre before you retire. But now that we're in the 1990s, I do have to give a shout out to Ghost in the Shell, where the opening of that movie is just awe-inspiring for a variety of reasons. I mean, the music's incredible, the imagery's incredible. Ghost in the Shell is a Hall of Fame science fiction movie. I was a little reluctant to include any animation on this list because if I start including animation, it opens up the door to all of Japanese animation, which would be like, oh my God, you could do a list of 100 erotic science fiction movies just from Japanese animation, but I did want to tip my hat to one of the best. And there is one animated movie on the official top 10 list, but we'll get to that later on. But if you've never seen Ghost in the Shell from 1995, hunt it down. But the 90s also gave us The Fifth Element, starring the lovely Mia Jovovich, who would later on make a huge name for herself with all the Resident Evil movies. I think when it comes to erotic imagery, I think the Resident Evil movies are sexier just because there's something about that red dress and those black boots. She's like doing backflips and cartwheels and blowing people's heads off. It's hot as fuck. I feel like when it comes to sexy sci-fi, Mia Jovovich is unquestionably, indubitably one of the all-time greats. New Rose Hotel. Here's a movie where I'm not quite sure that it is science fiction. It's based on a William Gibson short story, and if you go on Google and look up, erotic science fiction movies, New Rose Hotel comes up. From 1998, directed by Abel Ferrara, but I rewatched it a few nights ago. I was like, this isn't really science fiction. It's espionage, and it deals with technology, but I feel like it's not quite sci-fi-y enough to be sci-fi, but it's definitely erotic. Abel Ferrara was no stranger to eroticism in his movies. I mean, whether you're talking about Bad Lieutenant or friggin' King of New York or Miss 45 or Driller Killer or any of those movies, but New Rose Hotel features Asia Argento, who obviously now is a figure of controversy. If you don't know what I'm talking about, look it up. I'm not going to unpack all that crap here, but you've got Christopher Walken and Willem Dafoe basically competing for our affections in an elaborate game of espionage. But when it comes to eroticism, it definitely gets the job done. I just don't quite know if it's considered sci-fi. But the next two movies on my list definitely are The Matrix and Galaxy Quest. Both came out in 1999.
Dodge this.
Carrie-Anne Moss's Trinity in The Matrix has definitely achieved all-time great status, but Sigourney Weaver was not quite finished with sci-fi and eroticism. Obviously, she came up earlier in Alien in 1979, but 20 years later with Galaxy Quest, a movie which I think is still underrated by a lot of people. It's unofficially one of the best Star Trek movies ever made. It's kind of poking fun at Star Trek, but it is actually a loving, kick-ass homage to everything that makes Star Trek great. But her character is like kind of this classic dumb blonde, deliberately so. She's having fun with that kind of archetype where just over the course of the movie, her shirt just slowly but surely gets like wider and wider and wider and like showing off her bra and cleavage and that sort of thing. But Sigourney Weaver, bless your heart, you're a sexual icon for many reasons, and Galaxy Quest is just one of them. But we've made it into the 2000s, and I promise I'm almost finished with my honorable mentions. I put way too many honorable mentions in this video, but I couldn't help it. It's a topic that I'm passionate about. But Supernova from 2000, this movie is just an absolute mess. It had multiple filmmakers, multiple different cuts that everybody's kind of battling over. And anyway, people were taking their names off it. It was a total civil war behind the scenes, but what made it into the final cut, it's basically this bizarre science fiction movie where the entire crew of the ship, it's a rescue vessel that travels like interdimensionally, or they do dimension jumps over great distances. But every time they do a jump, they all have to strip down to be completely nude. So whether you like guys, girls, whatever, you're going to see the cast and crew of this movie over and over and over again, skinning off. Even James Spader, who I did not think of as like a really like rugged, masculine, kind of strong guy, he's shredded in this movie. But the reason you watch this movie is because Robin Tunney, she is not shy, and she strips down at every available opportunity. And Angela Bassett, a true movie-going or a screen icon, even she gets in on the fun. I've heard a rumor that it's actually a body double, but whoever is in that scene, it's like they're a fitness athlete slash runway model carved out of marble. Has to be seen to be believed. So not the world's greatest science fiction, but definitely really saucy stuff. And as I mentioned before earlier in the video, there's definitely a subgenre within erotic science fiction where people like to get it on with monsters and creatures and mutants and aliens and that sort of thing. And even Oscar-winning Adrian Brody is no exception to that, because in Splice from 2009, he throws down. It is a banana scene. I didn't see Splice when it first came out. It's from the same director as Cube, Vincenzo Natali. Cube's a really good science fiction movie. Not erotic, but it's a good one. But with Splice, you've got Sarah Polley and Adrian Brody trying to... Anyway, they're doing a lot of experiments. One of the experiments involves creating a semi kind of sort of human that can change genders, but also has like wings and a spiked tail. And when Adrian Brody finally surrenders to temptation, the way she takes her tail and kind of wraps it around something and pulls him tight, I was like, whoa, this is getting kind of terrifying, and justifiably so. But for the moment she starts like putting on makeup, you're like, oh my God, like start the countdown to where Adrian Brody can't help himself. But Splice from 2009, I don't know if that movie would be made today, but who knows? Now that The Substance has been a hit, maybe we'll start seeing movies like Splice again.
No.
But in 2013, something really special happened because a full-blown Avenger, Black Widow herself, ScarJo, threw down in Jonathan Glazer's Under the Skin. And I think people still just like overlook the fact that like the Avengers had come out the year prior. The MCU was in the stage of being on the ascent where like the sky was the limit. Nobody knew what the future might hold. And right in the middle of all this insane popularity, Scarlett Johansson's like, yeah, I'm just going to work with this rather unconventional kind of avant-garde director, Jonathan Glazer. Who knows what might happen, but I'm going to play an alien where I suck the life force out of people and spend half the movie walking around buck-ass nude. I was like, all right, like that sounds like something I might watch. And what I did not know is that the movie would be so fucking disturbing and terrifying. But goddamn, Scarlett Johansson, she's kind of captured in amber for all time in her prime, and the results on screen remain absolutely stunning. And then I think was it 2015 we had a little A24 erotica. Actually, I think Under the Skin was A24 as well. But hang on, why am I blanking on the name? Yeah, Ex Machina. 2014, holy moly. Alicia Vikander, very easy on the eyes. But the reason I like this movie, obviously the nudity is great, but the scene that made this movie just an absolute smash at that time, in my opinion, is the scene where Oscar Isaac starts dancing with the character Kyoko, played by Sonoya Mizuno, if I'm saying her name correctly, where Donald Gleason's basically like, how can we torp a picture? And he's getting all angry, and Oscar Isaac has this incredible line where he says, I'm going to tear up this fucking dance floor, like, check it out. And it's just absolutely fucking glorious. But yeah, as far as like recent examples of science fiction and eroticism colliding are concerned, Ex Machina is fantastic. And that brings us full circle to 2024, The Substance. And I'm sure I'm overlooking a few, but now it's time to finally get into my top 10 list. And as I mentioned earlier in the video when I was discussing Roger Corman, my number 10 is Forbidden World from 1982. And Forbidden World had been on my must-see list for many, many years because of that insane, just deranged poster. I mean, if you want to get people to watch your movie, create a cool poster. It's amazing how so many filmmakers overlook that one little trick, cook up a great iconic image, and even if it has nothing to do with the movie, you'll still trick a few people into watching it. But I finally saw Forbidden World. It is truly disgusting at times. I mean, if you like body horror and goo and practical effects, Forbidden World 100% delivers. But the reason it's on this list is due to Dawn Dunlap and June Chadwick. And Dawn Dunlap, she basically spends half the movie walking around in her underwear with sunglasses, even though they're in space, before like going into the steam room and things like that. But there's one insane sequence where June Chadwick's character is getting it on with, I think, the pilot, or anyways, the stud of the movie. And while you're hearing the soundtrack to the sex scene, and then one of the characters in the movie, you see he's playing like an electronic digital saxophone. It is some delicious early 80s cheese. But then there's this great clumsy exposition sequence. And every science fiction movie has a clumsy exposition sequence where people sit down and explain the plot and what's going to happen. But I love how for Forbidden World, Dawn Dunlap and June Chadwick are just standing there washing like the goo out of each other's hair because they've both been attacked by the monster. And just full frontal nudity. It's like, all right, you're going to have to listen to this really boring explanation of the plot, but while they discuss the plot, you're just going to shamelessly gaze after these two actresses in a lusty fashion. So Forbidden World absolutely deserves a spot on this list, as does Re-Animator, which is my number 9. And I'm going to cheat and turn this into a Stuart Gordon, Barbara Crampton, H.P. Lovecraft double feature, because we also have to give a shout out to From Beyond, which he made the following year. But with both Re-Animator and From Beyond, Stuart Gordon basically took these old school short stories by H.P. Lovecraft, dusted them off, made them feel a little bit more modern, and fleshed them out so they could be feature films. and gave us two of the most bonkers, fucked up science fiction films ever made. And H.P. Lovecraft is kind of notorious because he had a kind of a strange, troubled academic background where he read a lot of books, but he wasn't ever like formally educated in science or math. So his science fiction can come across as a little clunky, and it remains clunky in both Re-Animator as well as From Beyond. But the reason these movies are on this list is due to Barbara Crampton, one of the all-time great scream queens, and she worked with Brian De Palma and Body Double and a bunch of other stuff. But between these two movies, we get some truly diabolical scenes. One where I can't even begin to show it in this video because it would get me like thrown in jail. But the poster from Japan gives you an idea of what to expect. But the scene from Beyond is absolutely outrageous, where she starts throwing like all her inhibitions to the wind and starts like strapping on leather boots and whips and all that good stuff. But in any case, Stuart Gordon, he died way too early. I wish he had given us 10 more horror movies. But when it comes to combining science fiction, horror, eroticism, Barbara Crampton, H.P. Lovecraft, all that good stuff into a really potent, like undeniable brew, both Re-Animator and From Beyond will always have a place on lists such as these. But for my number 8, we're going to go all the way back to the late 60s. And this is a movie that kind of was the catalyst for this list, because without Barbarella, starring Jane Fonda, I don't know if this category of film would ever have taken off to the degree that it has. And when it comes to the director, Roger Vadim, I'm not quite sure how he pronounces his last name. He was born Roger Vadim Plemiennikov, but he goes by Vadim in the film business. But he was married to Brigitte Bardot. He was married to Jane Fonda. I think he dated Catherine Deneuve at one point. Yeah, he dated Catherine Deneuve in the early 60s. I mean, you want to talk about three of the most iconic blondes of that decade when it comes to sexual icons. Jesus Christ. I mean, Brigitte Bardot, Jane Fonda, and Catherine Deneuve. And he was kind of not even kind of, like a total slimeball. He was notorious for going out and gambling and pissing away all of his money, and then asking Jane Fonda to cover his gambling debts, and she would star in his movies in order to help generate money so he could piss it away on other stupid shit. Not to mention his constant efforts to get her to join in on all sorts of strange menage a trois he had planned for them as a couple. Once again, I don't know how somebody didn't just say enough's enough. You don't get to behave this way and continue. But he also directed Pretty Maids All in a Row in 1971. That's not science fiction, but written by Gene Roddenberry and well worth hunting down. But here we're talking about Barbarella, which not only features like the greatest zero-gravity striptease that'll ever be recorded, we also have two incredible movie posters, one by Robert McGuinness, one of the all-time greats when it comes to movie poster design, and another by Boris Vallejo, who I randomly met alongside his muse and partner Julie Bell at some like bodega up in Midtown Manhattan. I was like, oh my God, I know exactly who y'all are. Can I take your picture? I should have gotten in the picture. Anyway, I got to meet the great Boris Vallejo, but Barbarella, I won't claim it's a great movie, although I think Sydney Sweeney is working on doing a remake of it with, who's going to do the Barbarella remake? Hang on one sec. IMDb, Barbarella, can't remember. Oh, cool. They're thinking about bringing in Edgar Wright to direct. That actually could work. Edgar Wright, he would understand what makes the original movie tick, and obviously when it comes to being attractive, Sydney Sweeney has a mild reputation for being easy on the eye. So Barbarella, I'm not going to say it's my favorite science fiction movie in any way, shape, or form, but it does have some great scenes, like when Jane Fonda. This is very similar to Zardoz. Her character comes from a society where sex isn't really a thing anymore, but she meets this big, burly, hairy guy who wears a big, burly, hairy outfit, who introduces her to the physical act of love and leaves her singing and smiling and all that good stuff. But now for my number 7, I'm going to break my one rule. At the beginning of the video, I said there's going to be no porn on this list. However, Danny Perry, who wrote some of the best articles about film ever, wrote about this movie and made a very compelling case for this movie as great sci-fi. So it's not just me that likes Café Flesh, starring the great Michelle Bauer, but when it comes to taking like a full-blown, like hard X porn movie and combining it with a cool dystopian sci-fi world, I think Café Flesh might be the best example, because even if you were to strip out all the sex or like the explicit sex, I think it would still work. It wouldn't be quite as like provocative and it wouldn't be quite as potent, but it would still work, where you basically have a future where some people, a very small minority, are capable of sexual performance, and so they basically perform for everybody who is now sexually impotent. And Michelle Bauer, Jesus Christ, she made 150 million horror films and science fiction movies and thrillers and whatnot, where she would bear all, but this was toward the beginning of her career, and it gives me no shame nor embarrassment to admit that I'm a proud owner of Café Flesh on DVD. Hang on, my lamps are freaking out. Anyway, Café Flesh, if your taste in erotic sci-fi goes toward the more hardcore end of the spectrum, Café Flesh will 100% deliver on your wildest fantasies. And from a number 6, we got to talk about one of the most, insane, batshit crazy erotic science fiction films of the 1990s. A movie which was an absolute smash. Species from 1995.
She can have a dozen babies. She can lay 1,000 eggs.
Something's wrong.
Starring the legendary Natasha Henstridge, featuring designs and creature creation by none other than H.R. Giger, who provided all the designs for Alien. Now, a lot of the movies on this list are pretty obscure or kind of frowned upon or considered kind of sleazy, but there's no denying the fact that Species in 1995 was just a big, giant smash hit. On a budget of $35 million, it grossed $113 million. And it's hard to remember the last time like a schlocky mainstream science fiction movie just completely leaned into the fact that we're going to have a really, really hot monster or alien that everybody's lusting after, and she's going to spend most of the movie ripping those people to pieces, and it's just an absolute blast from start to finish. But it's got an incredible cast. You got like Ben Kingsley in there and Forrest Whitaker. It's like, wait a second, Ben Kingsley is in Species? It's just insane. And you got Michael Madsen and the lovely Marge Helgenberger. And as great as Natasha Henstridge is in this movie, I think it actually is Helgenberger who deserves the biggest high five. It's just this incredibly hot moment where they think the job's all over, but she yanks Michael Madsen's pants down as they're celebrating. And the way she looks up at him, I don't know if anybody has ever gazed at a man's junk more hungrily and more lustily than Marge Helgenberger. So yeah, that scene's incredible. But obviously, yeah, Natasha Henstridge, she wasn't even 21 yet when this movie came out. She was just getting started with her career. And luckily, the movie did spawn a franchise or a sequel. But sadly, the sequel, Species 2, is not as good, nor is it as successful. It was a true box office bomb. But if you have a winning formula, maybe don't replace the team, but it grossed about 25% of what the earlier movie did. However, I'm here to tell you, Species 2 is worth seeing. Is it a bad movie? Yes. Is it a kind of a terrible movie in a lot of ways? Yes. And I think they made a huge mistake by kind of sidelining Natasha Henstridge for a lot of the movie in favor of a male alien who's creating this brood of little alien children. But it's got some pretty fucking wild scenes. Like this astronaut, after he comes back from Mars, he's celebrating by getting it on with 2 sisters before he promptly impregnates them with alien babies which explode out of their wombs. I mean, the movie is grotesque and gooey and disgusting with tentacles and just shit flying all around. It is so schlocky and so trashy, but delightfully entertaining. And I think for everybody out there who has kind of neglected Species 2 in favor of Species, you owe it to yourself to take Species 2 for a spin. But we've officially arrived at my top 5, so it's time to throw some Stanley Kubrick into the mix with this adaptation of Anthony Burgess's A Clockwork Orange. And holy crap, this is one of those movies where at a very young, impressionable age, it just kind of took over my brain for like 2 straight months. It was in the summer between my junior and senior year of high school. I'd always heard about Clockwork Orange, had no idea what it was about. I just rented it at random without knowing any details about the story, popped in the VHS, and was thunderstruck. I ended up buying the movie. When I would drive around in my car as a kid, I would like look in the rearview mirror trying to imitate Malcolm McDowell's expressions, which might sound a little fucked up because this is a movie where the poster advertises prominently being the adventures of a young man whose principal interests are rape, ultraviolence, and Beethoven. I mean, you want to talk about the difference between the 1970s and the 2020s. Can you imagine the shitstorm that would greet the release of any movie trying to advertise what the story that it's telling in such a fashion? But Stanley Kubrick could pull it off because he's one of the greatest filmmakers who ever lived. And I've never read the novel, so I don't know where it departs. I've always heard that there's like one final chapter at the end of the book where Alex sees some of his old droogs still doing their thing. But I owe it to myself to read the book at some point. I'm a little intimidated by all the Russian slang.
Naughty, 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 you filthy old sunka.
But this is obviously a movie that's not supposed to be a turn on, or if it is a turn on, I guess that's part of the mad genius of it, because this is a movie where the first half of the movie you're seeing Alex do all these horrible things, and in the second half of the movie he's basically chemically neutered or castrated where he can't react to any sort of violence being inflicted upon him. So he definitely gets punished for all of his bad deeds, but the kind of the diabolical genius of the movie is that we are complicit in both his lusty behavior in the first half of the movie, where we're getting stimulated by the crime and the violence and the music and the race cars and all the crazy shit that he and his droogs are doing. And then in the second half of the movie, in spite of the fact that we know he is a murderer and a rapist and a total piece of shit in every way, shape, or form, we feel sorry for him as society starts kind of having a go at him. And it's incredible. After all the despicable things we've seen him do, we feel a deep swell of pity for him when he completely collapses in front of a naked woman, knowing that he can never respond physically to a beautiful woman ever again. And so, yeah, I like movies that kind of rip your brain into 1,000 pieces and just make you question a lot of your assumptions or make you question your own pride and your moral virtue and that sort of things. Very complex movie, wild movie, incredible style, incredible photography, incredible music, incredible performances. It's definitely one of the movies that helps make 1971 my favorite year of filmmaking. And even if you don't like all the disturbing ingredients of the movie, there are really, really funny scenes, like when Alex just goes to a record store and seduces two girls and takes them home for some fast motion, kinky behavior. So Clockwork Orange, when it comes to erotic sci-fi, it'll always be a cultural hand grenade that can shock and provoke even the most jaded and cynical audiences. But for my number 4, I'm going to go with Nicholas Roeg's The Man Who Fell to Earth, which I just saw for the first time. So perhaps there's some recency bias. I don't think it's a better movie than A Clockwork Orange, but I think it's a better erotic science fiction movie for reasons that I'm about to explain. But this movie had been on my must-watch list for decades, where sometimes when you're too aware of its importance or its popularity, or you've seen some scenes or you've seen the poster so many times, you almost kind of trick yourself into thinking, oh, I've already seen that movie. I can kind of categorize it in the back of my brain or kind of catalog it. But I hadn't seen it. I'd only seen pieces, including the lovely Claudia Jennings getting it on with Bernie Casey. I can't show that scene in this, but as I mentioned before, Claudia Jennings, she's my all-time favorite Playboy playmate. I previously mentioned her in, hang on, I'm totally blanking on the Roger Corman film because I'm talking about too many movies back-to-back, Death Sport from 1978. But she is not the feature attraction in The Man Who Fell to Earth. It's actually David Bowie. And if you're a big David Bowie fan from a more kind of horny point of view, David Bowie strips down in this. I mean, you see his ding-dong proudly on display in one of the most controversial sex scenes of the 1970s. And when you're talking about the 1970s, that's saying something. But in this movie, David Bowie plays an alien who comes to Earth trying to create technology that'll make some people rich, but also will enable him to get water back to his home planet. In any case, he rapidly gets seduced by alcohol and kind of hucksters and just all the sins and vices and all the deception of human civilization. But it's got Rip Torn in here. Also, I should mention, if you're into seeing the fellas, you also get to see Rip Torn's ding-a-ling and his dingus in this movie. And it's not something I ever needed to see or wanted to see, but I've now seen it, so I guess that part of my life is now complete. But it's Candy Clark who really gives this movie her all. There's just, when I mentioned before the gun scene, Candy Clark, she gets reunited with the alien later in the movie, and they decide just to throw all caution to the wind, and they're hooking up while playing with this gun. And that scene was cut. At least I believe early on, it was only in the UK where you could see the entire movie intact. But luckily now, anytime you look up The Man Who Fell to Earth, I think it's the 2-hour, 19-minute cut. That's the full, complete version. But if toward the end of the movie you don't get to see the famous gun sequence, well, then you know you're watching a censored cut of the film. But I should emphasize, this movie is definitely more for the artsy-fartsy crowd as opposed to the schlocky crowd. Like, if you want artsy-fartsy erotic sci-fi, watch movies like The Man Who Fell to Earth or Under the Skin. And if you want schlock, watch Roger Corman. But I should add that this is based on a novel by Walter Tevis, and I've only read one of his books. He wrote The Hustler, which was turned into the amazing movie with Paul Newman. And as soon as I saw this movie, and I was watching on a Criterion channel, and he's talking about how this movie kind of reflects how alienated and out of place he felt when he moved from San Francisco to Kansas or somewhere in the Midwest when he was young. But I'm going to need to read some more of his books because his books keep getting turned into great movies. And from that bit of commentary I heard on the Criterion channel, he just sounds fucking cool. So Man Who Fell to Earth, as advertised, dynamite science fiction, really intensely sexual and erotic. And I hope if you've not seen it, that I've encouraged you to at least give it a chance. But for my number 3, we're going to go into a movie which I've probably talked about too many times on this channel, but it must be included, David Cronenberg's Videodrome.
Got any porno?
You serious?
Yeah, gets me in the mood.
And I have no new talking points when it comes to Videodrome, but I tackled it earlier on my top 10 erotic horror movies video. I tackled it on my top 10 David Cronenberg video, and then I tackled it yet again when I ranked every single movie by David Cronenberg ever made. But Videodrome, it's one of my all-time favorite movies, and yeah, I'll probably never stop talking about it. I've even got this Videodrome t-shirt, which I'm fond of wearing in videos from time to time. But what is it about Videodrome that I find so fascinating and enticing and irresistible? I do think it's a very seductive movie, like where you're seeing this world of this kind of underground cable distributor, cable entrepreneur, where he's always on the lookout for really extreme content because he's got a small channel, so he has to show things that people can't see like on regular cable. But with all these clandestine meetings in hotels with people with like VHS cassettes and like briefcases, almost like they're drug dealers or arms dealers, that side of this universe is fascinating. But also just watching his relationship with Nikki Brand, a.k.a. Deborah Harry, where from the moment they meet each other, you can tell that they want to just like, jump all over each other. And during the first date, she's like, do you have any porno? They start getting into S&M and all kinds of stuff. But
you let somebody cut you?
Uh-huh. What do you think?
Well, I don't know.
You want to try a few things?
And you can tell James Woods, who's probably seen and done some pretty sketchy shit up to this time, even he's like, oh God, like as pervy as I might be, she's exploring terrain that is totally unfathomable and unknown to me. And I just find that side of the movie to be so alluring, especially as he starts like getting it on with his own TV set and like rubbing the veins on the top. I mean, it's bananas. And I was going to go with Videodrome as my number one. And in all honesty, it deserves the number one slot. I mean, David Cronenberg has explored erotica and science fiction many times over, like in movies like Crimes of the Future, which came out, 2 years ago? It's like, whew, holy moly. Yeah, like as much as like The Substance might have been very popular this past year, it's David Cronenberg who was mining this terrain long before Coralie Fargit. But yeah, I just feel like I've celebrated David Cronenberg so many times on this channel. I could create a little room for a few other heavy hitters for my number 2 and number 1 slot. So for my number 2, we're going to go back into schlocky terrain with Lifeforce by Tobe Hooper, starring Matilda May, and perhaps the most notorious 7 minutes of footage in the history of the science fiction genre. And at one point, this movie was called Space Vampires, but it might as well have been called Sex Vampires, because that's what it is. You have this space shuttle which discovers this alien spacecraft filled with hot, naked vampires in space. They're all kind of locked away in these crystal cubes, and male and female. And then this chick gets released on Earth, and every time she drains someone's life essence, they turn into these kind of cannibalistic, like flesh-eating zombies. It's the weirdest fucking movie because it's like a zombie apocalypse movie and a sex space vampire movie all in one. But it's just bananas. And the first time I saw it was at the Egyptian Theater in LA, the American Cinematheque. And as they projected the movie, it's one of the only times I've watched a science fiction movie where I was so turned on by the movie, I was kind of squirming in my seat, like, oh my God, like what is going on here? I couldn't handle just how alluring Matilda May was in this movie. And it's just also, it's totally bizarre with scenes with like Patrick Stewart, and I can't remember how the scene unfolds, but for whatever reason, they're talking to the vampire through Patrick Stewart, but then the main character starts like making out with Patrick Stewart in order to kiss the vampire. Anyway, like I've said for many of these movies, it's bonkers, it's insane, but it's also just a massive turn on. I mean, if you're watching a video about erotic science fiction, at a certain point you're like, all right, skip all the bullshit where I can kind of fast forward to the good parts. But I feel like with this movie, you shouldn't fast forward to the good parts because the good parts are kind of like the icing on the cake or the payoff for watching all the other stuff. And it is worth watching in its entirety, but yeah, truth be told, I have seen the good parts many times over. But Lifeforce, Tobe Hooper, you are sorely missed. While people are always going to know you more for Poltergeist and Texas Chainsaw Massacre and things like that, I've probably seen Lifeforce more than any other Tobe Hooper movie, and I'm an unabashed, unapologetic fan. But let's talk about my number 1, and it could only be heavy metal. Now, I discovered heavy metal in college because it had been out of circulation for most of the 80s and the early 90s because it's got all this incredible rock and roll music scattered throughout. And so heavy metal, the rights finally got sorted out. It finally came into our lives. My friends and I in college were like, hey, like, what the fuck is this? I think I just bought it sight unseen at a Blockbuster. But my friends and I took the cassette back to our fraternity house, ripped a few bong hits, threw the sucker in, and within minutes, we were all completely just in awe of this movie. Not only because the music's incredible, but like the storytelling is actually fantastic. It's an anthology film where you've got several short films, and most anthology movies are terrible. Usually you have like one or two good shorts in an anthology movie and a few other shorts that are unwatchable. The exceptions would be like Creepshow or Black Sabbath. That's a really good one. But Heavy Metal might be the best anthology film ever made because every single vignette or every single short is awesome. It's either like really thrilling and scary or really fucking hysterical, or as is the case with the story of Den, voiced by John Candy, based on the character created by Richard Corman for the comic Neverwhere. It might be the most entertaining short film ever made, where you have this nerdy kid who goes to another world, appears in the body of this big, bald, muscle-bound warrior who proceeds to either beat the shit out of every bad guy and or screw every hot chick known to man in the span of like 8 or 9 minutes. And it's, you know, as he says, like, God, after 18 years of nothing, like twice as one day, like what a place. I mean, John Candy's ongoing commentary about his adventures and the story, it's so goddamn funny. But obviously the last short film about Tarna, the last of the Tarakians, I think she is. Tarna, the last Tarakian. That's the longest. Some say the last short has some pacing problems. Perhaps they're right, but when it works, it really works great. But Tarna, she's basically called upon to avenge this society that's been destroyed. And we get this long reverse striptease as she puts on all of her armor and goes to war. And then she proceeds just to fuck up all these people and take them out, etc. and so forth. And it's just fucking badass. And I'll never forget being at San Diego Comic-Con about 10 years ago. I was hanging out with filmmaker Bill Plimpton. And while we're hanging out in this bar, they were showing behind-the-scenes footage on the screen of the live action, I guess, like the live action footage used for the rotoscoping of that scene. I was like, only in San Diego Comic-Con can I be hanging out with Bill Plimpton at a bar and they're showing the behind the scenes of the making of Heavy Metal. I just thought it was like just a cool kind of pop culture moment. But I did a lot of soul searching on this list, trying to figure out what is the greatest erotic science fiction film ever made. And suddenly it just came to me like a lightning bolt, like out of the blue, like something out of this movie. I was like, of course it's Heavy Metal. And Heavy Metal, I don't think it's got any close second because it's entertaining, the animation's gorgeous, the music's incredible, it's intensely arousing to watch. And so yeah, Heavy Metal, it belongs in the Animation Hall of Fame. And you know you're leaving a lasting and positive contribution to society and culture as we know it when Trey Parker and Matt Stone don't make fun of you, but instead celebrate your movie in an episode called Major Boobage, which is the 3rd episode of Season 12 of South Park. And if you have not seen it yet, watch it right now. You can thank me later. But it's time to wrap this sucker up. I can feel my energy fading. Thank you for sticking with me on this strange journey through my memories of all these bizarre movies that I've seen over the last couple decades. And please send me your recommendations. I always remain on the hunt, like I said before. I saw a ton of movies for the first time for this list, many of which just absolutely knocked my socks off. So, yeah, whatever I've overlooked, definitely leave me a comment in the comments below and just let me know what you thought of this video and if you would like to see more videos of a similar nature. But as always, remember to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell. I would greatly appreciate it. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.